The sun was a hammer over the Malpais, beating the color from the sky until it was a bleached and indifferent sheet of white. Heat shimmered up from the fractured earth, turning the distant mesas into trembling ghosts. Nothing moved save the wind, a dry whisper that carried the scent of dust and decay, and the patient, circling shadows of buzzards high above. Their lazy spirals were a punctuation mark in the vast, empty sentence of the landscape, a sign that something below had surrendered. Closer, the ground was a tapestry of rock and thorn, stitched with the faint, fading tracks of shod ponies moving fast and light. A single set of tracks veered away, a drunken stagger of scuffs and gouges that ended where a woman lay broken against a slab of sun-scorched basalt. She was a ruin of buckskin and blood. One leg, twisted at an unnatural angle, was a swollen mass of purple and black beneath torn leggings. Her name was Tala, and the name meant wolf, but now she was just bait. She watched the buzzards, her lips cracked and bleeding, her black eyes holding not fear, but a cold, simmering fury. They had left her. Her own people, riding from the blue-coated soldiers, had deemed her shattered bone a greater burden than her warrior spirit was an asset. The shame of it was a hotter fire than the sun on her skin. A new sound broke the desert's humming silence. Not the wind, not the birds. The slow, rhythmic clop of a single horse, heavy and deliberate. Tala's hand, gnarled with dirt and dried blood, crawled toward a shard of rock. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had left. Through the haze of heat and pain, a figure resolved itself. A white man on a dun horse, both of them looking as worn and weathered as the land itself. The man's face was geography, mapped with sun and hardship, a faded scar cutting a pale canyon from his temple to his jaw. He reined his horse in, his eyes not on her, but on the circling birds. Then his gaze dropped, finding her. There was no surprise, no alarm. Just a quiet, assessing stillness. He swung down from the saddle, his movement stiff. He favored his left leg, a subtle but permanent limp that spoke of an old argument with gravity, or perhaps a bullet. He stood over her, his shadow a momentary, blessed relief. "Looks like you've had a bad day," he said, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. Tala glared, saying nothing, clutching her rock. He saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth might have been a smile, or it might have been a grimace. He knelt, his bad knee cracking in protest. He looked at her leg, then back at her face. "They'll be landing soon," he nodded at the sky. He reached for her. She flinched, a hiss escaping her throat. He stopped, his hands held open. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "All right." He moved slowly, deliberately, his motions telegraphing his intent. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her good knee. As he prepared to lift, he met her defiant gaze. His own eyes, the color of a faded prairie sky, held a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. "I'm not leaving you." The journey was a blur of jolting agony. Each step of the man's horse sent a fresh wave of fire through her leg, a fire that burned away the edges of the world until all that was left was the man's back, a solid shape of faded denim against a swimming sky. He had bound her to him with a length of rope, her body slumped against his. She could feel the heat of him, smell the dust and sweat and leather of him. He was a wall against which the pain crashed. He didn't speak. The only sounds were the plodding of the horse, the creak of the saddle, and her own ragged breaths, swallowed by the vast silence. They rode toward a cut in the low hills, a place where the rock bled into sparse, hardy juniper and pinon. Tucked into the earth like a secret was a cabin, less built than grown from the landscape. It was made of stone and rough-hewn timber, with a sod roof that made it seem a part of the hill itself. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin grey thread against the bruised twilight. He dismounted with practiced care, his limp more pronounced after the long ride. He untied her and lifted her again, his arms straining with the effort. Her weight was nothing, but he carried it like a penance. The cabin's interior was as spare and stark as its owner. A stone hearth, a single cot, a rough table and 2 chairs. Everything was clean, ordered, and worn with use. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something medicinal, like dried herbs. He laid her gently on the cot, the straw-stuffed mattress a shock of softness after the hard ground. He moved to the hearth, stoking the embers and adding a piece of juniper, which spit and crackled, filling the small room with a sharp, clean scent and a flickering, orange light. The firelight danced across his face, throwing the scar into sharp relief. He brought water in a tin cup, holding it to her lips. She drank greedily, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat. Then he came toward her with a knife. Her body went rigid. But he only knelt and, with precise, careful movements, began to cut away the ruined buckskin from her swollen leg. He worked without expression, his focus absolute. The revealed limb was a horror of discolored flesh and protruding bone. He examined it, his touch surprisingly gentle, his calloused fingers probing the extent of the damage with a knowledge that was not a doctor's, but something more practical, born of necessity. He looked up, meeting her wary gaze in the dancing firelight. "This is going to hurt," he said, a simple statement of fact. He worked for what felt like an eternity. He cleaned the wound with whiskey that burned like a brand, and she bit down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming, the sound a low, guttural growl in her throat. He had hands that knew their way around broken things. She watched his face, taut with concentration, the firelight catching the sweat on his brow. He fashioned a splint from pieces of a broken crate and strips of clean cloth, his movements economical and sure. When he was done, her leg was immobilized, the terrible, grinding pain lessened to a deep, throbbing ache. He moved back, wiping his hands on a rag, and finally sat in the chair across from her small cot, the silence returning, deeper now, filled with the unspoken reality of what had passed between them. For 3 days, she drifted in a fever dream. The world was the wooden ceiling of the cabin, the shifting shadows cast by the fire, and the man's quiet presence. He was a constant, moving in the periphery. He spooned broth into her mouth, cooled her forehead with damp cloths, and checked the bindings on her leg. He never spoke unless necessary, his voice a low rumble that was more texture than sound. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. She woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's single, grimy window, dust motes dancing in the golden shaft of light. The man, Silas, as she'd heard him mutter to his horse, was sitting at the table, meticulously cleaning a rifle, the parts laid out on an oilcloth. He sensed her gaze and looked up. His expression was unreadable. "You look like hell," he stated. The words were a stone skipping across the still water of the room. A spark of her old self flickered to life. "Still prettier than you," she rasped, her voice raw. A corner of his mouth lifted. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. He went back to his rifle. The rhythm of their days fell into a pattern. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. The smell of coffee would fill the cabin, followed by the sound of him chopping wood or tending to his horse. He would leave for hours at a time, returning with a rabbit or a brace of quail slung over his shoulder. He was a man who belonged to the solitude, who wore it as comfortably as his worn-out coat. She watched him, a captive audience. She saw the way he favored his leg, the unconscious grimace that would cross his face when he thought no one was looking. He was as broken as she was, just in a different way. His wound was old, scarred over, a part of his landscape. Hers was new, raw, a landscape still in violent formation. One afternoon, he came in to find her struggling to stitch a tear in his spare shirt using a sharpened bone needle and a thread of her own sinew. It was clumsy, painstaking work. He stopped in the doorway and watched her for a long moment. He said nothing, just turned and left, returning with a small tin box. He opened it and placed a proper steel needle and a spool of dark thread on the blanket beside her. It was an offering. An acknowledgement. A conversation without a single word. Her strength returned in small, hard-won increments. The fire in her leg banked to a persistent, smouldering coal. She could sit up on her own, her back against the rough stone wall, and the world no longer spun. From this vantage, she learned the geography of Silas's life. Every object in the cabin had a purpose and a history. The chipped enamel coffee pot, the neatly stacked firewood, the worn handle of the axe leaning by the door. It was a life stripped to the bone, and she found a strange comfort in its starkness. She took over the mending, her nimble fingers a stark contrast to his calloused, clumsy ones. She repaired his shirts, patched his canvas coat, and restitched the beadwork on her own tattered moccasin, a small act of reclaiming herself. He would return from his hunting or trapping and find the finished work laid out for him. He would pick it up, examine the neat, tiny stitches, and give a single, brief nod of approval. That nod was his praise, his gratitude, his part of the dialogue. One evening, he brought in a scrawny jackrabbit and tossed it on the table. He began to skin it with a hunter's efficiency, but his cooking was a crude affair of fire and grease. She watched him for a moment, then cleared her throat. "You will ruin it," she said. Her first unsolicited words. He paused, knife in hand, and looked at her. "It's just meat." She shook her head, a small, sharp motion. "Give it here." He hesitated, then pushed the skin carcass and the knife across the table toward her. She set to work, her movements precise and ingrained. She used the herb Silas kept in small pouches hanging from the rafters, one she recognized from her own people, and cooked the rabbit slowly over the coals, turning it until the skin was crisp and the meat was tender. She served it on 2 tin plates. They ate in their usual silence, but it was different. It was a shared meal, a communion. The food wasn't just sustenance, it was a story she had told him, a piece of her knowledge given freely. After, as he cleaned the plates, he glanced at her. It was good. She merely nodded, a flicker of pride warming her chest. The silent treaty between them was solidifying, built not on words, but on shared tasks and mutual respect for competence. He was the protector, the provider. She was the one who tended the small domestic hearth, turning his Spartan shelter into something that felt, precariously, like a home. The intrusion came on a Tuesday. She knew it was a Tuesday because Silas had made a small scratch on the doorframe that morning, one of 7. The sun was high and hot when the sound of 2 horses approached, their gait unfamiliar. Silas, who had been splitting wood, went still. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his body becoming a study in tense stillness. He picked up his axe and leaned it against the cabin wall, a casual placement that was anything but. 2 men rode into the clearing. One was large, with a florid face and a silver star pinned to his vest. The other was younger, thinner, with nervous eyes that darted everywhere. The man with the star, the sheriff, reined in his horse and looked from Silas to the cabin door, where Tala sat in the shadows, watching. "Silas," the sheriff said, his voice carrying an easy authority that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you took in some company." Silas didn't answer. He just stood there, his weight resting on his good leg, his scarred face impassive. "Folks down in Dusty Gulch are talking," the sheriff continued, ignoring the silence. "Talking about you harboring a stray Apache. A dangerous stray, by the sounds of it. From that band that shot up the Lowry Ranch." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Silas's boots. "That true, Silas?" Silas's gaze was flat. "She was hurt." "I brought her in, hurt or not, she ain't welcome," the younger deputy piped up, emboldened by his superior's presence. "We don't want her kind this close to town." The sheriff held up a hand, silencing the deputy but agreeing with the sentiment. "Listen to me, Silas. I've known you a long time. I know you like to be left alone. But bringing one of them here, that's inviting trouble you can't handle. The army's still scouring these hills. They find her here, they won't ask questions. And the folks in town, they're scared. Scared people do stupid things." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping. "Get rid of her. Take her far out and leave her. It's for the best. For everyone. Especially you." Silas's eyes flickered toward the cabin, a barely perceptible movement. He saw Tala, her face a mask of stone, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. He turned his gaze back to the sheriff. "She's under my care," he said, the words low and final. The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Don't say I didn't warn you." He wheeled his horse around, the deputy scrambling to follow. Their departure left a vacuum in the clearing, a ringing silence charged with menace. The fragile piece of the cabin had been shattered. The air in the cabin grew thick after the lawmen left. The unspoken threat lingered in the dust motes, clung to the rough-hewn walls. Silas came inside and put the coffee pot on the fire, his movements heavy, deliberate. He did not look at her. Tala watched his back, the rigid line of his shoulders. The world he had built, this small island of solitude, had just been breached, and she was the cause. The silence stretched until it was a thin, tight wire. Later that evening, the pain in her leg flared with a vengeance, a sharp reminder of her own helplessness. Frustrated, angry, she pushed herself up from the cot, determined to stand. Her splintered leg buckled instantly, and she cried out, stumbling against the table. Silas was across the room in 2 quick, limping strides, his hands catching her arms to steady her. She was stiff, resistant to his touch, her face a mask of humiliation. He held her there for a moment, his grip firm but not harsh. The scent of pine and wood smoke from his clothes filled her senses. "Easy," he grunted, taking her weight. The proximity was startling. For weeks he had been a presence, a caretaker, but now he was just a man, holding her up. The top of her head barely reached his chin. She could feel the solid muscle of his chest, the steady, slow beat of his heart. It was a rhythm of immense calm in the center of her own turmoil. He helped her back to the cot, the brief, intense moment of contact leaving an echo in the space between them. He sat in his chair, staring into the fire, the scar on his face a deep groove in the flickering light. "Why?" she asked, the single word sharp in the quiet room. "Why'd you bring me here?" He didn't turn. He picked up a small piece of kindling and began to whittle at it with his knife, the blade moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. Shavings fell like pale snowflakes onto the hearth. "Couldn't leave you to the buzzards," he finally said, his voice low. She watched his hands, the way the knife moved with such purpose. "The sheriff is right. I bring you trouble." He stopped whittling and looked at the piece of wood in his hand, then at his own bad leg, stretched out toward the fire. A grim, humorless smile touched his lips. "I've had trouble before." He met her eyes across the small space, and for the first time, she saw the deep, old weariness in them. "I don't dance," he said, a quiet, gruff admission of his own brokenness, a reference to the limp that defined him. Tala looked down at her own splintered, useless leg. A strange, wry understanding passed between them. "I don't walk," she replied. The wire of tension snapped, replaced by a fragile, shared acknowledgement of their respective cages. In the days that followed, the unspoken conversation between them deepened. The threat from the outside world seemed to wall them in further, cementing their strange alliance. She saw him cleaning his rifle more often, his eye scanning the ridgeline when he thought she wasn't looking. He was preparing for a trouble he refused to name. She, in turn, began to reclaim her own strength. She started doing exercises for her good leg, for her arms, pushing against the confines of the cot until her muscles burned. The fight was returning to her eyes, replacing the dull resignation. One afternoon, she found a smooth, pale piece of cottonwood left on the blanket beside her. It was perfect for carving. She looked over at Silas, who was mending a bridle, pretending not to notice. She picked it up, along with the sharp knife he always left within her reach. For hours, she worked, the scrape of the blade on wood a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. The wood began to take shape under her skilled hands, the form emerging from the grain as if it had been waiting there all along. She carved a hawk, its wings half spread, its head turned as if listening to the wind. It was a symbol of her clan, a messenger, a sign of resilience. When she was finished, she set it on the small shelf above the hearth. It was a small, defiant piece of her world, placed squarely in the center of his. Silas came in later, his boots heavy with mud. He stopped and saw the carving. He walked over to the hearth and stood before it for a long time, his back to her. He didn't touch it, but she saw the line of his shoulders soften. He understood the gift. He understood the statement. The next day, he found her examining the worn leather of his saddlebags, the stitching frayed and broken in several places. Without a word, she pointed to the damage. He nodded, and brought the bags to her. She spent the entire afternoon with them in her lap, her bone all and sinew thread flying. She didn't just repair the broken seams, she reinforced them, her stitches small and even, stronger than the original. She tooled a small, subtle pattern into a corner of the flap, the winding river, a symbol of a long journey. It was her signature. Her story, stitched into his. When he saddled his horse the next morning, he ran his thumb over the new pattern, the calloused skin tracing the lines of the river. He looked toward the cabin door, where she sat watching, and gave that same, small nod. It was enough. It was everything. The first snow came early, a fine, tentative powder that dusted the high peaks and turned the air sharp and clean. Inside the cabin, the fire was a constant, hungry beast that Silas fed with a steady rhythm. The cold drove them deeper into their shared space, their movements learning to accommodate one another in the small confines of the room. Their routines were now a seamless, unspoken dance. He would bring her fresh water, she would make sure his coffee was hot when he came in from the cold. He would bring in firewood, she would have a hot meal waiting. The boundaries of caretaker and patient had blurred and dissolved, leaving two solitary people sharing a fragile shelter against the world. One night, the pain in her leg gnawed at her, a deep, restless ache that the cold seemed to sharpen. She shifted on the cot, trying to find a position that offered some relief, a low groan escaping her lips against her will. Silas, who had been oiling a trap by the fire, looked over. He got up and came to her cot, kneeling beside it. "The binding is too tight," he said, his voice a low murmur. Before she could protest, he began to unwrap the cloth strips. His touch was no longer clinical or hesitant. His hands were confident and familiar as he massaged the cramped muscles around the splint, his thumbs working with surprising gentleness to ease the tension. She didn't pull away. She lay still, her head turned toward the fire, watching the way the light played on his scarred face, illuminating the intense focus in his eyes. He was mending her, not just her bone, but some deeper fracture she hadn't known was there. He worked in silence, his breath warm in the cold air. When he was finished, he rewrapped the splint, his movements deft and sure. The gnawing ache had subsided to a dull, manageable throb. He pulled the thick wool blanket up to her chin, his knuckles brushing her cheek for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a spark in the quiet dark. He stood and went back to the fire, picking up his trap as if nothing had happened. But something had. A wall had crumbled. The raw, desperate gratitude she'd felt when he saved her had slowly, imperceptibly, transformed into something else. Something quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous. It felt perilously like trust. Weeks bled into a month, then two. The snow grew thick in the high country, isolating their small valley completely. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the snow-covered clearing, and the dark line of trees beyond. The warnings of the sheriff seemed to be a memory from another life. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the wind in the pines and the crackle of the hearth. The peace was a living thing, a fragile creature they both nurtured with their silence and their small, daily acts of care. Tala could now move about the cabin with the aid of a crude crutch Silas had fashioned for her. The splint was gone, replaced by a permanent stiffness and a pain that would always be her companion. She walked with a limp that mirrored his, a broken rhythm they now shared. One evening, a fierce wind howled down from the peaks, rattling the door in its frame and sending puffs of smoke billowing from the hearth. It was the sound of abandonment, the sound of being left behind. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and the smell of roasting quail. Silas sat across from her, sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a comforting sound. Tala watched the flames dance, her hawk carving seeming to watch with her from its perch on the mantel. A feeling she couldn't name settled in her chest. It was not happiness, for she had forgotten what that felt like. It was a quiet sense of rightness, of being in the only place she could be. She was no longer just a survivor, she was an inhabitant. This small, protected space, built by this quiet, broken man, had become her territory, too. Silas finished with his knife and looked up, his gaze meeting hers in the warm, flickering light. He saw not the fierce, cornered warrior he had found dying in the desert, but the woman who sat before him now, her face softened by the firelight, her presence as essential to the cabin as the hearth itself. He looked at the neatly mended saddlebags in the corner, then his gaze moved to the hawk on the shelf. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, a recognition of the home they had accidentally built from their combined wreckage. He stood and walked to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the old fear, the fear of being left. He turned back, and on his face was a look of grim contentment. The storm outside only served to heighten the sense of sanctuary within. He walked to her and, without a word, draped a thick, heavy wool blanket over her shoulders, its warmth a solid, comforting weight. She did not flinch or pull away. She simply nodded, accepting the gesture, and pulled the blanket tighter, the quiet peace settling around them like the deep snow outside. The moment of peace held, suspended in the amber light of the fire. It was a perfect, fragile thing, like a bubble of warm air in a frozen world. The storm outside raged, a distant, muffled roar that made the silence inside the cabin feel sacred. Silas stood by the hearth, one hand resting on the stone mantel, near her carving. Tala sat wrapped in the blanket, her hands finally still in her lap. For the first time since her people had ridden away, the constant, grinding need to simply survive had eased. In its place was a quiet, profound stillness. They were two solitary creatures who had found an unlikely den, their shared wounds a language more eloquent than words. The future was a blank, snow-covered page, but for the first time, it did not seem terrifying. It simply was. Then, a flicker. A sudden, unnatural orange light bloomed against the small windowpane, gone as quickly as it came. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't the fire. Silas went rigid, his head snapping toward the window, his entire body instantly transformed from rest to high alert. Tala's heart gave a hard, painful lurch in her chest. She saw it too, a second flicker, this one brighter, dancing on the far edge of the clearing. A torch! A tremor ran through the floorboards, a low, rhythmic vibration that was not the wind. It was the thud of multiple hooves on frozen ground, muffled by the snow. It was not the sound of a lone rider. It was the sound of a posse. The men from the town. The sheriff's warning, delivered on a hot, dusty day, had finally come to fruition on a cold, bitter night. They had come for her. Silas moved without a sound, his limp forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took the heavy rifle down from its pegs above the door. The metallic click as he checked the chamber was deafening in the sudden, tense silence. He didn't look at Tala, but he spoke, his voice a low, hard growl that was stripped of all its former gentleness. Stay away from the window. He moved to the side of the door, pressing his back against the log wall, the rifle held ready. The torchlight grew stronger, painting the snow outside in hellish strokes of orange and black. The sound of the horses grew louder, closer, circling the cabin like predators. Tala's hand closed around the handle of the carving knife on the table beside her, her knuckles white. Her body was a taut wire of pure, cold fury. They had found her. They had come to destroy the one small piece of peace she had found in the wreckage of her life. Silas glanced back at her then, his face a mask of grim, resolute fury in the encroaching torchlight. His faded blue eyes met her dark, blazing ones across the small room. There was no fear in his gaze, only a terrible, shared certainty. The world had come to tear them apart, and they would meet it together. Outside, a man's voice shouted, coarse and full of menace. "Silas! Send out the squaw!" The standoff had begun.